Welcome, Chris Kito. We have today to talk about his near-death experience, which I just feel like is a fascinating subject to educate people on, because I think, our culture, our country doesn't really do the best at educating around the other side, death, dying. It's really kind of a tough subject for a lot of people to talk about. So thank you so much for being here, Chris. And
Thank you for having me, Liz. Pleasure to have recently connected with you and to be on your show and have a great conversation.
likewise. All right. So start us off, Chris, with just maybe how old you were, where you were, and just the experience, even for people who don't even know what a near-death experience is. If you can just kind of give a little background into that, and then what happened for you.
Absolutely. So I had a near-death experience, otherwise known as a near NDE, about 11 years ago. It was in Los Angeles at the time. I currently live in Florida, and I was born with a peanut and tree nut allergy. And I went into a delayed anaphylactic shock from accidentally consuming a peanut in a piece of cake. Delayed because it was not instant. The actual anaphylaxis started several hours later from when I first ingested the peanut. From that moment on, I later that night went into the process of going into anaphylaxis, the hives, the closing of the throat, and from there I did suffocate, which led to my near-death experience while I was in the hospital. Very fortunately, I was able to make a full recovery from that experience. But that is, in short summary, my near-death experience. And in other videos, I go into much, much more detail and can speak for an hour about that. I know we have a little different format right now, but there is more details to that elsewhere.
So just taking it back a little bit into, I know you've referenced like, oh, I took a bite and I know something wasn't quite right. I could feel this tingling. And what was the part of you that just kind of said, nah, and didn't react right away? I mean, were you somebody that typically listened to your intuition, or were you somebody that kind of dampened like worries down? Like, what really made you just go, I'll be okay, I'll go home?
Well, that's a really great question because a lot of it, I did not know what a lot of nuts and peanuts even taste like. Like I don't actually have that, know what that taste is. And I did not think there should have even been peanuts or any nuts. It was a peanut, but I didn't think there were peanuts in the cake. I had no idea that they were even in there. I don't know what the taste was. It was so quick and instant. I was just taking a bite. And it wasn't even like a large peanut in there. It wasn't even visible. So you factor all of that in, looking back of how did that happen? It's that quick. You don't know the taste. You weren't expecting it. It's never happened before in 22 years.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really almost the perfect storm of an incident waiting to happen where everything lined up. Also being in a social setting, also being within a group of people, speaking with a group of people, you're not fully conscious. You're just, how many times does anyone can relate to the situation of being at a large party, eating with other people? Are you really aware of every single bite you have? And then you're not aware of how often are there really peanuts in birthday cake? That's tends to be a little rare. I think I've never seen it since once, Liz, anywhere. You just don't see it.
Well, I'm sure the story got out there and restaurants were a little nervous. So
yeah, restaurants and everyone having a birthday party. I mean, it's not even that common, like peanuts in a birthday cake. So a lot of things lined up, unfortunately for me, but then they also lined up, fortunately for me, later that evening and into the early morning while I was in the hospital and going through the anaphylaxis and in the months after of a recovery and processing everything like that. So going back to your question specifically with intuitively understanding, looking back, I mean, I knew in the moment something was off. I didn't know what, but again, there was a delayed reaction. There was no initial reaction. It was, oh my gosh, something happened. I think it was a peanut. Oh my God, I didn't even realize it was in there. So there was a little bit of a confusion and a slight panic in the moment, but it was looked at as I could take a couple of Benadryl and this would be fine. We've never had anything to go off of in the past of how dangerous or what the level of anaphylactic, or if we would even get to anaphylactic reaction.
Okay, so this event unfolds. You eventually get in front of the mirror. You're like, this is not good. You get to the hospital, your body is starting to not respond well. And then, can you kind of take us from there and really just explain what happens that most of us don't get the experience of?
Yeah, so at this point, as you said so eloquently, I realized things were deteriorating very, very quickly. I could also physically feel it. I was covered in hives. My breathing was becoming slightly more labored, not to the point where I thought I was suffocating, but I felt it. I felt it becoming more labored. I felt very uneasy. I was having the hives, and I thought, okay, I have to do something now. This is not going to get better. This is most likely getting worse. Again, I have no experience in this. I don't know what was going to happen, what could happen. Is this the worst it's going to be, or is this actually just leading up to it being significantly worse going forward? So I decided to drive myself to the hospital. I got to the hospital. I remember very clearly in that moment, like, focusing so hard one to get there, and then also just continuing to breathe, but being consciously aware the entire time, knowing that it was more and more difficult to breathe every single second, it felt like. And I remember going into the ER and asking for identification, pulling out my wallet to hand my ID over. I mean, I was losing motor function. I remember I could barely get like the driver's license out of little slits in the wallet. And then they kind of pulled me back in, and then a lot of it early at that point, like, it gets a little hazy, but it's also extremely vivid at the same time, because I knew what was going on mentally. I was clear, but
Okay.
physically I was falling apart and I wasn't able to breathe. And then they went through the medical procedure of having to stop an anaphylactic reaction with epinephrine, Benadryl, oxygen, and trying to reverse it, because epinephrine sometimes doesn't always reverse. Right.
Right.
Oh, it doesn't always work. That's why they always give you two EpiPens, because sometimes you have to do a double injection. And then they were thinking about, putting a tube down my throat and going through all of this. So there was a very intense medical period for about probably a half hour, 40 minutes that went on. And I got a lot of this information after,
And so
if I was going to I'm sorry.
I don't remember when you, I just for clarity, when you say you were mentally clear, but your body's deteriorating, can you explain what that's like when you're mentally functioning, understanding, and the body isn't working properly? What does that actually feel like?
Well, you're consciously aware. So depending on, I'll speak for myself. Uh, there's the moment of how traumatic and frightening it is knowing you're suffocating,
Mhm.
versus getting to the point where there was a euphoric feeling then of the acceptance and realizing and knowing you're going to die. So it kind of went through the entire spectrum. And when I say you're consciously aware, it wasn't with other stories you hear of someone blacking out or not having the memory, or I don't know what happened. I passed out at that point. I did not pass out. I was aware throughout all of this. So, driving myself to the hospital, your mind is racing. Okay, I'm having trouble breathing. I'm having trouble breathing. I can't breathe. It's harder and harder. You get there, you're watching it in like slow motion, everyone work around you and put needles and in a panic state trying to go through the medical procedure to stop the anaphylaxis. And you're aware, you're watching it like it's like a movie in front of you in a way.
Okay. And so then what happens? When does it switch over? Does it all of a sudden you're not aware mentally? What's the shift that occurs for you?
Well, there was never a moment I wasn't aware mentally. I would just say it felt I was always aware from every second I was aware, but the feelings and the energies changed. And there was a point when all the pain, all the trauma, everything just kind of stopped and slowed. And I had this understanding that I was dying. And I knew that. And I kind of accepted it. Not that I wanted to, but when I say accepted, I was like, oh, it's happening. Like this is happening. And I was like, ah, there wasn't a fight at that point. And it was just like, oh, I think it was more of a realization that it was happening, like a familiar, distant, familiar feeling, I would say. And that was, yeah, that was when it really shifted. It was very euphoric. There was no pain whatsoever. There was nothing. Um, I was gone. I was not in this physical realm, or consciously I was leaving.
Okay. And how long were you actually not alive for?
I didn't technically flatline.
Okay.
So I always had a pulse
Okay.
and cardiac function.
Okay. And then I remember something from your story about hearing, was it your grandfather's?
Yeah, so in that moment, um, I had both my grandfathers with me in spirit. And that's the best. Language is extremely limiting when you're describing spirituality, consciousness, and especially near death experiences, because these are not on this realm. So I always do as much as I can language wise to paint a picture and give the most accurate description of what was going on. So in that moment, yes, I had both my deceased grandfathers with me, felt them, saw their energy, understood their energy. The communication was like telepathic, I would use. It was just an understanding.
Mhm.
Um, that other NDEers have used before, the language of just like a wave of just knowing. Like it was just there. It wasn't, again, language is extremely limiting because we don't have language for this. What is it? There just isn't. So I'm it's trying to connect that as much as possible. Um,
And so what was their message to you, if there was one?
yeah. So the message was that it was not my time to die and that there was work to do. And then in that moment, I understood, and like it kind of shifted a bit where I thought, like, and even in that communication with them, it was like, and I remember thinking to myself, and my consciousness was, I don't want to die. Not that I ever wanted to, but it went from what's going on to then that connection, then nope, don't, you can't, it's not time, you have work to do. And I remember thinking and finally saying, no, I don't want to at all. No, no. And and this was beyond euphoric feeling at this point. Like there was no pain or anything. I just remember like coming back into my body. And I always liken it to the scene in the movie Saving Private Ryan when they're on the beach on D-Day and they cut the sound
Mm.
and Tom Hanks is just looking around and sees all the chaos. That's exactly what it was like. Like I didn't hear anything, I didn't feel anything, like I was gone. And then it snaps back in and it snapped in for me. And then like I instantly just remember like trying to breathe and feeling pain and all of these things. Like there was no pain. Like I felt nothing. Like it was beyond a euphoric, blissful feeling. And then with instantaneously, I was back in my body and I felt everything, the desire to breathe, scrape, function, like grabbing for air, where I was almost very minimal responsiveness leading up to this at this point. And I felt everything. I just remember the intense pain coming back, like shooting back at me, like coming in, like that was it, like
Yeah.
air.
Sound effect.
It
Yeah.
just flipped on, and the switch flipped. So I was back. And then I remember becoming verbal. I remember asking for oxygen. I needed more oxygen. That was fully turned up. I remember like, little snippets. I remember a very good amount. The one thing with that was I did not have a concept of time. That's the one thing. I knew the events, I knew the sequence of events, but I did not have any concept of time. I was in the hospital for about like 6 to 8 hours,
Okay.
actually.
And you were
Um,
thinking it was much shorter than that?
yeah, I had no idea. I thought it was like an hour and a half.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so obviously this is kind of a shocking experience for you. And do you go home after that and tell people, or are you kind of weirded out by the experience and going, I'm not?
Well, that's a great question. So I went home that night and just went to bed, and then the next morning, like everyone does, they wake up and clip off the little
Yeah.
hospital band, and they have like little socks with the rubber on the bottom so you don't fall. And I had no idea what an NDE was. Nothing. Like that wasn't in my vocabulary or consciousness. So I just remember like you have the first 3 or 4 days to a week after it was physical recovery. Like it was so hard to breathe. Like everything hurt. Chest hurt, this hurt, body is beyond aching. I mean, the amount of chemicals that were pumped through me throughout that night was a massive list. So that had to get out. So once the physical pain subsided, because when you're in physical pain, you're not really thinking about the spirituality or the emotion. You're like, oh my God, I'm in so much pain.
Yeah.
So once that was over, things were different. I've always journaled my whole life. So I always go back and look at my journals and go through it. But I knew I had a consciousness shift, and I can go back and read multiple times. I've said that over a few months, but it wasn't until probably about 8 weeks after that, randomly, and I don't know exactly how, but it was just divine that I came across the IAN's website, and they had like, have you had a near death? I listed like 35 traits, and I had like 34 of the 35. And I was like, oh my gosh. So I called them. I said, hey, like, is there anyone in, the Los Angeles area? So I was connected with people that way. And then I had more conversation. They said, hey, you had a near death. And I said, well, this is what happened. But none of that was in my vocabulary. None of that was even something that was aware. I never knew of near death. I never had any of it. I'm just, oh my God, I have no idea what's going on. Because for the first like 6 months, 7 months, I would wake up every single day and I wouldn't know who I was in the sense of like I knew how to tie my shoes, I knew how to speak, but I like consciously it was different. I was totally different. Even people that knew me like a little bit, because I moved to Los Angeles for about 6 months prior, that knew me before, then after, saw a shift in a shift in me. So there were so many changes, and even we sit here, 12 years late, 11 years later, we're still always integrating an experience. It's lifelong. It doesn't ever end. Um, maybe that's a beautiful thing. You're constantly evolving and integrating and realizing and growing spiritually and consciously. But the first 6 months were very challenging because, well, the first 8 weeks, not knowing what was going on. Then you know what's going on. Then you're like, oh my God, I got to figure this out. When's this going to end? And then there've been over the course of the last 11 years, there's been blocks like on year like 5 or 6 or 7. It's like that was a really tough like 6, 7, 8 months. Oh, that's in the NDE community when the other shoe drops or whatever it may be. But it's still difficult. It's not enjoyable for me to speak about it by any means. And there's a lot of emotion and energy around it, but I do it as an act of service. I never spoke about my NDE fully, and if for probably about like 7 years after, I
Wow.
wouldn't discuss it. I made like 1 or 2 attempts, but if I did, it was probably only like 60% of the story, and not even the good 60%. So it was, and a lot of NDE stories have like, that I call that Oprah moment where it's like all wonderful and amazing and uplifting. And, mine had a lot of, was very violent, very traumatic. Suffocating to death is not, if I could pick many ways to pass away, that would not be on the top. That wouldn't be in the top 10. Um, so there was that as well. And then you're processing so many other aspects, the consciousness shift. I was 22 23 at the time, I think 24 at the time. And, you're growing into your career, adulthood. I'm from New York and Connecticut, and then I moved to West Coast. And you're seeing like you then change as a person. So you have the NDE on top of whatever you were as a person, then it completely shifts.
Mhm.
So you're integrating that. You're integrating just becoming into adulthood. You're integrating career. You're integrating, and then toss a near-death experience on top when you have a complete consciousness shift of maybe ideas you have, believe in, what you want, don't like. And, I was very fortunate. I didn't grow up in a very heavy religious household. I always was very spiritual, very intuitive. So I had a very good background and basis to work with this. And LA was really a very nice basin of, alternative therapies, and the holistic new age community was really fantastic. And that was really played a major part into my healing and integration, was to be able to dabble into anything and everything. And what really worked in my healing process and what works for others is everyone's different, but being able to test all of it and seeing what worked for a little bit, what didn't. It was really special, and that absolutely helped me to get where I am today. And even with all of that, it still took about 7 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, 7 years, almost eight, to speak about it openly.
So you kind of mentioned that you noticed some shifts, people around you were noticing some shifts. So what can you describe the shifts, and then maybe what led to going, okay, I think I'm ready to talk about this?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, the shifts were everything from more of a sense of physical to more of a sensitivity to light and noise to I've always been very intuitive, but really ratcheting it up 10x intuition and that ability. I tend to not, and again, there's so many, but like I don't eat a lot of red meat. So there was all of that. Then there was just the sensitivity of really being able to pick up energy, sensing things, being more grounded at times. Sometimes I'm not, it bounces, depends. And then really just having to be aware, even to this day, of energy and everything around me. I mean, I'm in my office now. Every desk in this office has a salt lamp. We've had the office feng shui. We have crystals, essential oils. We have specific type of music that's played. You can see behind me, the office is covered in art, and our logo is a butterfly. So that's all reflective of that. I've created a certain energy vibration of, and I've always focused in on energy and light and love and what is the consciousness. And the bigger change is being aware of that in my own, but also what am I engaging in consciously, and what do I want around me? And that's not just in my personal life, but that's also in my businesses, that's in my friendships, my circles, and I'm very aware of that. And I use that language, and that's something I'm very particular to in
And
my
so
home and space. So that all wraps into the NDE, because I that is something that's ingrained in my essence at this point.
and so that's a beautiful shift, right? I admire that. And I'm just wondering, did you find people that also loved that shift? And then in addition, people that were like, I don't know, Chris, you kind of a little out there.
I don't know. I think I was always a little kooky, so it didn't really matter. No, I've been very fortunate. My family never knew the full story till about 8 years later, when they actually watched a video that a couple other 100,000 people watched. So they didn't even know
Wow.
exactly what happened. No one did,
Okay.
uh, until a video that actually came out March of 2020. So we're
Mhm.
talking 8 years later. That's a long time.
It's a long time.
That's a
Yeah.
long time. So yeah, and I don't wear it on my sleeve. And again, for 8 years, I didn't talk about it, and there wasn't all these videos and YouTubes and podcasts and interviews like this I'm doing. So if someone Googled me, there wouldn't be NDE things that came up. So it wasn't something that came up often. I would just say I have a peanut allergy, I have a nut allergy, if that even had to come up. So this wasn't a topic that came up, or I even like dove into it and like, oh, by the way, this happened. Like I never discussed it ever.
And
Uh,
so what started the healing for you? Like you said, you kind of dabbled in all these different things, but
well,
was
I immediately I've always been spiritual, but then this kicked it up more, and we had to really have a healing process. And I've done everything from Kabbalah, traditional sweat lodges, all types of healing, from Reiki, sound baths, crystals, meditation. I mean, cold plunges. So, I mean, anything you could imagine, I've dabbled in, and some have resonated with me, some have not. All different books on spirituality and healers and mediums, and working with all of that. So I was always on that path. It just kind of got me moving along a bit more, and
Beautiful.
making that more of just a part of my life, that
Mhm.
it's just always there. But the speaking, I don't know the exact moment. Someone asked me to speak in an IANS group to about an audience about like 80 to 100 people. And I did it. And I'm like, you know what? I should just do this. I have to do this. It's been 8 years.
Mhm.
And then it just kind of snowballed from there. And there was really two reasons why I did it. One was it was very therapeutic and healing for me to discuss it. And I think there is a lot of truth in discussing in a talk therapy. And that's what it was for me, to go and talk about the experience, what happened, and kind of like, in my terms, like relive it or re-engage with the thoughts and the motion and that energy, which is still probably in my body. I mean,
Mhm.
I felt things, up like 7, 8 months ago. I felt like, wow, that's still being released. I felt energy released out of my arm. I was in a healing session, and like it came, I had a lot of needles in my arm. It was coming into my left side. And I felt, I'm like, wow, like that's like 9 years later, we're still releasing blockage in my left side from a near death experience 11 years ago. Um, and then the second part was, I've never listened to anything I've ever spoken or about, or any video. I've never watched myself speak. I've never listened to myself speak on anything, even to this very moment. And I did not know how big of a community of people globally there were that really resonate with these videos, or are looking for guidance, or just hearing something to give peace to whatever situation they are in, whether they're dealing with depression, grief,
Mhm.
loss of a child, loss of a mother, whatever that may be. Um, and when these videos started coming out that I was doing, I would get people to reach out, or like comments and say, "Hey, thank you," or "This happened," or "I appreciate it." And that was really special, I thought. And that goes into like where I'm at now, which is, this is my giving back. I'm very fortunate. I walked out of that hospital. By all accounts, I should have died. Absolutely. Like, it was a miracle I survived. Like, I was given a second chance. So if I can, have these interviews or speak or sit here with you, and if there's one person or two or whatever that may be that can resonate because there's something niche that they don't have a family, friends, or community, or they don't know where they're looking, but there's a video and there's something I might say or on anything that brings them peace or helps them, I'm for that. And that's part of the many things I do to give back. This is one that's so niche, because it is so niche, and it's so personal, it's so deep. I mean, when you start talking about consciousness, spirituality, and death and dying, that's very, very intimate. And that's not something many people, and I don't even want to have those conversations unless I'm in this setting. And I look as I speak to a certain audience. Someone, you have to find what we're talking about. You have to find the NDE community. It's not just out there on Main Street. And the people that are looking for answers. They're looking for some connection. They're looking for something that might not be entirely mainstream right now, and they need to hear. And if that can bring some peace and hope and healing, I'm all for that. Absolutely. Absolutely. And
I
that's
think
why
you're probably impacting more than one or two people with each video, but I
I'll
will
take
ask, because that is so important to you, what would you say to someone who has lost a child or a sibling or even a parent? I think, losing a child is probably the most tragic, but they're all
yeah.
tragic. But what would
That
you offer them?
that's a really great question. And there's nothing I could ever say, I feel, that would ease their pain and suffering.
Mhm.
And I'll say this, I don't have anything to specifically say. I think that individual or that family will listen and they'll hear what they need to hear, but it's not me to say something directly.
Gotcha.
I think that's really the truth. And that's been my experience, is that I don't set out to tell, I don't have a magic answer on anything. Don't, don't have it.
Mhm.
But I'll tell my story and, how I feel. And you know, people are really creative, and something will just hit and resonate, and it will help them. And I don't know what it is, because you could say something that you feel means nothing, yet that could be like so impactful to me. That could be life changing. That could be, what, you connected the dot for me, or hey, just hearing that story, I don't know what it was. That just gave me the initiative I needed, or it got me out, or something connected, or it did this. And so again, I don't have anything to say other than my story. I'm open, I speak, I'm as authentic and honest as I can possibly be, and as articulate as I can be, given the challenges of the story and also the emotion behind it. Because every time I speak about this, it's very difficult to discuss on a personal level, even 11 and a half years later. So I just hold the space. So I hold the space, and I let that individual or whoever find what they need to find. And sometimes they do with me, sometimes they don't, or other people. But I don't have any answer, and I don't know if anyone has any answer. I think it's always up to the individual to go on that search, and they'll find it. They just have to be open.
Yeah, Chris, you've mentioned a couple times like this it's really difficult to talk about, and I'm just wondering for other people that have the fear of talking about it and have waited maybe 8 years or maybe 12 or 15 or 20, um, if you can kind of try to put into words what that discomfort or the resistance or however you choose to explain it, what do you think was getting in the way for those 8 years, and what is still the kind of continual struggle, even though you're doing it? What?
Well, in simple terms, it was a very traumatic event that's difficult to speak about. Most people, I don't feel, would want to discuss openly and publicly
Mhm.
a very traumatic, life-changing, violent event in their life. That's really the bottom line. With that, then on top of that, or any event, not even a near-death experience, and you take someone like an awful moment in someone's life, they don't want to talk about it all the time. There's plenty of other things to discuss. Um, and with that, I would say, as traumatic, violent, and as it was, there's also an equal amount of gratitude, beauty, consciousness, love, and appreciation for everything. And I've come to realize that. And I've always, even from the beginning, I was so appreciative. Oh my God, I had, writing a thank you note to the ER staff that saved my life. You want to talk about grounding and gratitude? Write a handwritten note to someone that saved your life with their hands.
Mhm.
That I will never forget, that the doctor that saved me, and the team of nurses and professionals. So that was one of the most grounding and grateful moments of my life. Of that really clears everything up. So I, it was just very difficult, and then working through the process. But I look at it as an absolute blessing, and I look at it as I'm so fortunate, and I live with an absolute state of gratitude in everything in my life. Doesn't mean I don't get upset day to day, or I'm still, I'm fairly impatient with most things. But that's a separate initiative. Um, but I there's the essence, and the core is a sense of gratitude, and that I was given an opportunity. And when you've had something and you've overcome and you've grown and evolved, and you continue on that path, it gives a lot of meaning to life, and things are very special. And even when there are little things that aggravate you, like traffic or this or that, whatever, something that's totally irrelevant, not even a day later, like 2 hours later, like it completely, I'm fortunate where I can go back and be like, wow, this really means absolutely nothing. Doesn't mean I still get reactive about things. Everyone does, but I can snap out of it quick and really ground out very quickly. So I'm very fortunate. I'm fortunate I walked out of there. I'm fortunate that I was able to function and I was able to be in a community and had a path in the last 11 years that I was able to successfully integrate this and still go on a spiritual path of evolution and consciousness and be able to and have the opportunity to give back, have the opportunity to speak about a very, very niche topic that's very difficult to speak about. And also speaking, I'm 35 now, there's not a lot of young men talking about near-death experiences and spirituality and consciousness. If you look at that space, it tends to be older and also tends to be female. I don't really know anyone else around my age that is openly discussing these things of spirituality, near death, consciousness, and then also taking that and then still having to live in this physical world and do well, have a business career, interact with people, have, functional relationships and go about all that, having had a near death experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the work that you're doing will allow younger men in their 30s to or 20s. I think it'll inspire them to speak, and I think it's part of what you're doing. And I just one last question for you is just how do you think this has impacted you finding your purpose in life and sense of gratitude and joy and things like that?
Great question. Great question to end on. I live with gratitude every day. I've said in many interviews I've done, I believe gratitude is the most powerful emotion in the universe. It's the most grounding, it's the most loving, it's such a high vibration, I feel. And it shows appreciation, it shows love, it shows an understanding. And I feel we need much more gratitude. And that would be, if anyone asked for one line, I would say focus on gratitude, whatever that is, journaling. Find 3 things every day you're happy for, even if it's just that when you were driving on your way to work and the light that you always have to stop at was green, be grateful for that. That will shift your vibration and energy immediately. So being in that state is fantastic.
I love that's what you're ending with, because I've been telling my mom that for so long. And sometimes you just need to hear it from someone who's not your own child. So I appreciate that. And thank you so much, Chris, for coming. And, maybe we'll do something again in the future, but I am sincerely grateful for your time and your energy. So
Thank you so much, Liz. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
you're welcome. You have a great day.